The Lord's Supper memorializes the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. The Lord instituted this memorial with his disciples as they observed the Passover just prior to his betrayal and crucifixion. We read of this as Matthew chapter 26, and beginning in verse 26, Matthew records these words. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it. And he gave it to the disciples and said, Take, eat, this is my body. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on, until the last day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. We see here that there are two elements in the Lord's Supper. There is the unleavened bread, which represents his body, and there is the cup containing the fruit of the vine, which represents his blood. The Christian world at large uses a few different terms to refer to this memorial. Some call it the Eucharist, a term which signifies thanksgiving. And while we should certainly be thankful for the sacrifice of Jesus, that word itself is never used by the inspired writers of the New Testament. Another word that is sometimes used in the Christian world is the sacrament. Again, this is a word that does not appear in the scriptures in reference to the Lord's Supper. If you will recall, one of the principles of the restoration plea is to call Bible things by Bible names. And that is why we prefer to call the Lord's Supper the Lord's Supper, as that is what Paul called it in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 20. Sometimes we may refer to it as communion. Paul also uses that term in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 in verse 16. When we simply stick to the Bible, and we do that calling Bible things by Bible names, then we can easily identify our practice as being in harmony with what the church of the first century practiced. While we can sing and we can pray at any time, as Paul and Silas showed in Acts chapter 16, singing and praying while they were locked up in prison. And we can study our Bible, read the Word of God, just like the Bereans did every day in Acts chapter 17 and verse 11. There is a specific when it comes to the Lord's Supper. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, we have the inspired record telling us that on the first day of the week, when they came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, he spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. The primary purpose of their coming together was to remember the Lord's great sacrifice as they broke bread. And they did this on the first day of the week. Now we understand this to mean every first day of the week. The Israelites were commanded in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. They understood that meant remember every Sabbath. So too we understand the first day of the week to mean every first day of the week. There is a first day in every week, and that is the only day in which we are authorized to observe this memorial of Jesus' death. The Apostle Paul talks about the seriousness of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Beginning in verse 27, he says, Therefore, whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. We don't examine each other. We examine ourselves, and we examine the manner in which we partake. as a memorial of the Lord's death and what that means for us as individuals. We are given an opportunity to consider our relationship with God. Now, it should be noted, however, that the worthiness in this context does not refer to the person who is observing the Lord's Supper, but the manner by which it is observed. James Burton Kaufman, in his commentary on this passage, wrote that many Christians have erroneously concluded that their unworthiness forbade their observance of the supper. But this is not true at all. Indeed, who was ever worthy to eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of God? The moment any man might suppose that he was worthy to do such a thing, the presumption itself would deny it. Nevertheless, there is a real danger here. If any person shall partake of this solemn rite without discernment of the event it memorializes, or without regard to the obligations imposed by it, or without any consistent effort to partake of it continually and faithfully throughout his life, or until the Lord comes, or without the due reverence and appreciation due to such an ordinance, then such a person becomes guilty of the body and blood of Jesus. The meaning of this being that he, in a spiritual sense, has become a crucifier of the Lord himself. Now, there are some who have overemphasized the Lord's Supper by thinking that it is all that is required of them. They do not attend any of the Bible classes or other activities of the church. They rarely sing, and in some congregations where the Lord's Supper is observed prior to the sermon, they leave as soon as they swallow the fruit of the vine. Nowhere in the Scriptures are we told that any part of worship is so important that any other part may be disregarded or neglected. Jesus told the woman at the well in John chapter 4 and verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. That is, we must have the proper attitude as well as the proper actions in our worship of the Almighty. If we elevate one avenue of worship above all others, to the point that we deem the others unnecessary, does that demonstrate a proper attitude? God tells us how he wants us to worship him. We should never take it upon ourselves to change that by overemphasizing one avenue over another. Sadly, some have gone to the other extreme and have underemphasized the Lord's Supper, neglecting its observance. They may partake monthly or quarterly or annually, but again, this has no scriptural basis. We have that approved example of the disciples in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, who came together on the first day of the week to break bread. How dare we suggest that we need fewer reminders of the Lord's great sacrifice than they did in the first century? When observing the Lord's Supper, we should do that with our best effort to focus on Christ's death, to focus on the importance of that sacrifice, to remember that his blood was shed for many for the remission of sins, as he said in Matthew 26 and 28. And it was by that blood that the church of God was purchased, as Paul said in Acts chapter 20 and verse 28. If one's mind is on some business venture or sporting event, or how long the sermon is, or how long the services are, or on any other matter other than the death, the sacrifice, the love, the grace of Jesus Christ, then it is virtually impossible for that person to properly observe the Lord's Supper. Now, there are several things that we can do to help us meditate, to help us concentrate on what we are doing. We can read some scriptures that deal with the Lord's Supper or with the cross. Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 25. Matthew chapters 27 and 28. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 20 through 30. These are all passages that can help us focus on the purpose and meaning of the memorial. There's also Old Testament prophecies that deal with the Messiah's death. One of my favorites is in Isaiah chapter 52 and 53. It begins in the end of chapter 52 and includes the entirety of Isaiah 53. The great prophet of old writes, beginning in Isaiah 52:13, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him. For what had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider. Who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness. And when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death. And he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bore the sins of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. What a wonderful opportunity that we have each Lord's Day to reflect on this great fulfilled prophecy as we remember the Lord's sacrifice. other things that we can do to help us focus on the observance of the Lord's Supper, the importance of it, the meaning of it. There are a great number of hymns that will help us focus in on what we're doing. Songs such as The Old Rugged Cross, or He Paid a Debt, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Reading over the lyrics of those can help us focus and meditate. Those who are leading the song service often choose a hymn to help us in this manner, to sing before we observe. Other people simply bow their heads, they shut the world out, and they pray, concentrating on and giving thanks for the Lord's great sacrifice for us. Brother David E. Hansen wrote, "The Lord's Supper is a memorial service. Jesus said, 'Do this in remembrance of me.'" Luke 22:19. Jesus left no shrouds, personal relics, or statues of himself. Only an unpretentious act, the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is the world's greatest monument commemorating the world's greatest event. As Christians remember Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, they become conscious of their past need. They were sinners without hope, and their present responsibility to live a life of purity and devotion to God. Hopefully this week, when you partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, you can focus a little bit more, consider more about the Lord's sacrifice, what it means to you personally. I pray that this lesson has been beneficial and that you can take these things to help you better observe that great memorial feast on the first day of the week. God bless.